interview is being conducted for St John's, Scotland, 75 years of making a difference. My name is Dr. Sue Morrison and the respondent is Ewen Macdonald. This is June 2022 and the interview is taking place in Glenrothes. Thank you very much for agreeing to be interviewed.
Oh, you're welcome. Yeah.
For the record, would you please confirm your full name?
Yeah, my name is Ewen Alexander Macdonald.
Thank you. Would you mind giving me your year of birth?
Yes, it was 1952.
Thank you. And where were you brought up?
I was brought up in it's a good question. I was brought up in the town of Kennoway, which is not far from here. But my parents met in Cooper, and my father was in the police, and my mother was a sister at the Adamson Hospital in Cooper. And eventually they married, and I came along, and my father was posted to Anstruther. So we were there for I think about 3 years, and unfortunately he came down with cancer and died whilst he was in Anstruther, and that meant that my mother then had to move from the police house in Anstruther, and we were given accommodation, a council house in Kennoway. So my brother, who was less than a year old when my father died, and I and my mother moved to Kennoway. And it was a really strange set of circumstances because the local doctor in Kennoway was a Dr. Ross, and he had trained in Edinburgh Royal Infirmary whilst my mother was a theatre sister there. And she had a responsibility for trainee doctors going through theatre. And of course, when he learned that she was now in Kennoway, where he had his practice, he approached her and he asked her if she would become a practice nurse with him, which she did. So she ended up being there until she retired, and enjoyed it, and was well known throughout the whole community, you know. So.
Thank you. How did you meet your wife?
So I was, at the time, I was a member of Fife Constabulary, and initially, obviously all policemen start off in uniform, and so I was based in Kirkcaldy and Leavenmouth. And whilst at Leavenmouth, I applied to join the Scottish Crime Squad and was fortunately successful. So I went there with about just over 5 years service, and I was based at Fetties in Edinburgh, and as you do, you socialise, and this particular day we had been involved in a fairly major surveillance exercise, and it had been very successful. So we had all sort of at the end of the day gone to the pub, and then, as you do, sometimes after you've had one or two drinks, you want to move on. And so a few of us moved on to what was the police club in York Place in Edinburgh, and kind of gate crashed a function that was ongoing, and it was there that I met Leslie. She was, her elder sister was married to a policeman as well, and they were having a discotheque or something like that, I think it was, for the Police Sea Angling Club, and we just met during that evening, and it was good. We enjoyed it. We enjoyed each other, and from then on arranged to meet again, and everything else is history, as they say.
And you now have a family?
We do, yeah. We've got a family of 3, 2 boys and a girl. Our eldest James, he lives down in Witham, which is down near Chelmsford. He's married and got 2 wee kids, a boy and a girl. My daughter is a teacher here in Glenrothes, and she's married, lives in Glenrothes, and has a wee boy and a wee girl as well. And my other son Alan He works just outside Glenrothes in Thornton, and his wife is a carer, and they too have a wee boy and a wee girl. So we're kept pretty busy most of the time. Yeah.
So 6 grandchildren.
6 grandkids. Yeah. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. Would you tell me a wee bit about your own career? It sounds very interesting.
So, as I said, I started off in uniform. Really, at the time, or not long after, we had unit beat policing with the introduction of panda cars. So I started off walking a beat in Kirkcaldy, and then evolved into a panda driver. And I don't know if you've seen Heartbeat, but Heartbeat have got this Ford Anglia with police on it and a blue light, and that was exactly us. And then we evolved from Ford Anglias into Ford Escorts, and eventually, because of my height, I ended up working on the area van, which was a Ford Transit van, and thoroughly enjoyed it. Great job. However, I got the opportunity to move on to the Scottish Crime Squad, and worked there, which was totally different, basically. Long hair, beard, holey jeans. It was primarily a major crime and surveillance unit. And there was 2 offices. There was one based in Edinburgh and one based in Glasgow. And we covered the whole of Scotland, really looking at travelling criminals. We got involved in major inquiries and murders where we were asked to come in and help other forces that didn't maybe have the resources we were able to pool. So I did that for 3 years, and thoroughly enjoyed it. It was great. And as I said, during that time, met Leslie. When I came back to my own force at the end of the 3 years, because it was a 3-year secondment, we got married not long after I returned, and we bought our first house in Kirkcaldy. And during that time I worked in Cowdenbeath, which wasn't too far away. I had come back from that unit into uniform again, which was like night and day, but it was very good because it brought you back down to earth, put you back into the police mode again. And after a short while in uniform, I went into CID and worked in CID, which was just a divisional CID in Cowdenbeath. And then shortly after that came into our own Force Crime Squad, which was based at headquarters then here. Again, becoming involved in things like drugs, fraud, major investigations, murder, things like that. And it was whilst I was in our own crime squad that I became a firearms officer as well. During the time I did that, we were involved quite a lot with royal visits, and I did some protection work as well in connection with these visits. Eventually I came out of our own crime squad, and I was promoted to I came out into a unit called Special Branch, which again was quite unique and different. I ended up spending about 12 years in Special Branch, and then approaching retiral age, I came into work in Glenrothes, and came in as an inspector and took over community policing eventually. And strangely enough, that was where I first came across St John. So it's a nice inroad for that. Whilst I was in Glenrothes, I became aware of a fact that all these strange people once a month would come and take over our library and have a meeting. And eventually I took an interest to find out what it was that these people were actually meeting for, and learned a wee bit about St John. I sat in on a few of the meetings, which were mostly really talking about projects they were involved with and fundraising events that they were involved with. And at that time, they probably had a group of about anywhere between 20 and 30 people meeting monthly. Eventually I was asked if I would like to join them, but at that time I was just approaching retirement, and I had arranged another job where I was going to work locally in Glenrothes with a company called Raytheon. Raytheon is an American defence company, and they had bought over a company called Hughes Microelectronics, which was part of the Howard Hughes empire. And Glenrothes, as it was being built up as a new town a number of years before, had been able to attract quite a number of American technology companies, and Hughes was one of these companies. And it had set up in the centre of Glenrothes, and at that time employed 1,300 or 1,400 people. It was quite a big concern. However, it had been taken over at some point by Raytheon, and a lot of the work that they did then turned a wee bit more towards the defence side of things. Anyway, as I retired, I finished on the Sunday with the police, and I ended up working on the Monday morning with Raytheon. And so I ended up working with them for quite a number of years, eventually being responsible for security for them, for the UK, for their sites in Canada and also in Spain. And I thoroughly enjoyed it. It was a superb company to work for, and it actually linked in many respects with some of the work I had been doing previously in the police. Unfortunately, in 2014, I took sepsis completely out of the blue. We were arranging my daughter's wedding, Catherine's wedding, and we had been around several hotels looking at venues, and I began to think that I had just come down with the cold or a flu or something like that. And over the weekend, we had been to a couple of locations looking at them for venues for the wedding, and I had got up on the Monday morning to go to work. Felt really a bit strange, but certainly very fluey, and I phoned in to the office just to say I was going to work from home that day because the rest of the week I was due down in London. And just as the morning progressed, Leslie took the dogs for a walk and came back home after about an hour, and really didn't like the way I was. She phoned the doctor, and while she was on the phone to the doctor, I collapsed, and she just put the phone down and dialed 999, and fortunately an ambulance was in the locality, and very quickly took me into hospital and effectively saved my life, because I went into toxic shock and ended up in intensive care for a couple of weeks, and then in high dependency for a wee while, and the renal ward after a while. But luckily they looked after me very, very well, and I survived it. I ended up losing my toes and the instep of my feet, which affects me a wee bit now with walking. But the offshoot of it all was that it was going to be very difficult for me to go back to work, so I just retired. Raytheon were very good. They kept me on the books until 2017, and I then retired fully. And it was a sad ending really to what was a really great job, because I thoroughly enjoyed it. But in between all of that, to go back to St John, I became a member of St John eventually. As I said earlier, they asked me if I would join, but because of my involvement with Raytheon and the travel I did abroad, I didn't feel I could really contribute. But I did suggest that Leslie, my wife, should become a member perhaps. So that's what happened. And eventually she put my arm up my back and I became a member as well. And to be honest, I quite enjoyed it. The great thing about St John is that the people who are involved with St John are nice people. They're very dedicated, they're very straightforward people as well. Effectively, they want to help other people. And it's a great organisation. I thoroughly enjoyed my involvement with them. I very quickly came on to the area committee. Leslie was at the time the treasurer. She was eventually elected on as the chair for the area committee, and I took over as treasurer. And I've held that post now for just over 3 years. And it keeps me pretty busy, I have to say. So that's probably a quick resume of my life up until today, basically.
Thank you very much. That was a very full and interesting, very interesting answer. Could I ask you to talk me through some of the fundraising activities that you were involved with in the early days?
Sure. In the early days, as I said, there was a huge committee. There was easily 20 or 30 people who were very active locally here, and they were involved in all types of fundraising things, not just here in Fife, but also became involved in fundraising just outside our borders, where there were some nice big houses that would do cheese and wine or host concerts, and we would go and support all of that as well. As a group in Fife, we really went to local events. We did collections at supermarkets or wherever else we could, and we would attend fetes. We'd get involved with concerts ourselves. We ran concerts up at the Hill of Tarvet House just outside Cooper, and these are all relatively successful events. But I think as years have gone on, I think the events that we were involved with initially benefited from the group being a bigger group. It was much easier for us to run events and have them sold out, basically. And then during these events, when we had a lot of people present, we could do other fundraising things in between. But latterly, what we found is that it's very difficult to get people out of their houses to attend events unless there's something very special about that event. And even before COVID, we were finding that it was becoming harder and harder to fundraise other than by fundraising at sort of supermarkets, shaking cans. The generosity of people was always there. I mean, folk were always always happy to put money in cans, but it was very difficult to encourage people to come out and take part in events that we were organising. We had a couple of very successful events with other clubs, like folk clubs and things like that, sponsoring events for us. So they would run the event, and say that any funds raised were going to come to St John's. So that way we managed to raise a reasonable amount of money over the years. But we also had charities whom St John supported as well. And so, it was quite easy to use these charities to promote St John, whilst at the same time raising funds for them. And we were reasonably successful at that as well. But I think more recently, and certainly as a consequence of COVID, it's been very difficult to fundraise. Over the last couple of years, we've really not been involved greatly with fundraising at all. We still have collection cans in supermarkets and things like that, but actual events as such are not. It's not easy to organise at the moment.
What would you say is the main challenge there?
I think what I recognise is that over the years, as I said earlier, over the years, our numbers have dwindled. We used to have an active group both in Kirkcaldy, in Dunfermline, a group here in Glenrothes, a group in St Andrews who were very active as well. But over the years, people get older, and natural wastage means that these groups eventually fold. And we're now operating in Fife with one group which is based really here in Glenrothes, but to which folk from all over Fife attend. The difference is that we've moved from numbers in the area of about 30 active members down to probably about 8 or 10 active members. And it's very, very hard to encourage other people to join us. People nowadays appear to be reticent to become involved in things. And I see that with Rotary as well, where Rotary struggles to bring new people into clubs. So I think one of the major things that we've got to really become involved with is to try and encourage new people into St John's, because if we don't, a lot of areas will eventually fold because we need new blood basically coming into them. We've managed to recruit quite a number of volunteers, particularly for our patient transport service that we're running. And also 1 or 2 volunteers to become involved with CPR training and defibrillator training. But the reality of it is that the more we become involved with these kind of these services, if you like, the more volunteers we need, because the more we do, the more is expected of us. And the reality of it is that the small group that we are just now is very difficult for that small group to give the commitment that other people expect of us now. So I would say that one of the major things that we really have to concentrate on is recruitment within St John's, continuing recruitment with volunteers without a doubt. But probably part of the issue, I suspect, is that a lot of people don't know very much about St John's. There's not a huge knowledge out and about, and even when we're out and about speaking to people, their automatic reaction is that we're all part of St John Ambulance Association, which really has nothing to do with anything in Scotland as such. But that's how people look at St John's. And I don't know how easier it is to change that perception and really open the door a wee bit more about the work that we do within St John.
Publicity is an issue that is raised by, I think, every one of the respondents that I've interviewed. And as I said earlier, you're number 32. Do you think what is needed is a local campaign, or perhaps national campaigns, or a mixture?
Personally, I think it's probably a mixture. The it's very difficult because I think over the years, St John itself has not particularly moved on. I think looking from the outside in, for a long time it was male orientated, and even then it was mostly elderly men that were involved in it, which is understandable because to give a commitment into something like St John, the probability is that most people are going to be retired or of retirement age anyway. But I think there needs to be a kind of turning round a wee bit. That element of it has been the sustaining factor of St John. That's what's kept St John going. And I think there's definitely a place for it. But I think there needs to be a recognition too that St John itself probably needs to move on a wee bit in order to attract new people into it. The ceremonial part of it, I think, is great. I think the ceremonial part of St John is part of its history, and certainly I wouldn't want to see that disappear. But I do think there needs to be a slight change in direction. There needs to be an encouragement of younger people, and by younger people I don't mean in their 40s or 50s, I mean younger people in their late teens, early 20s, who have got a different perspective on life and who are the ones who are going to bring St John out of where it is just now and make it continue on for years to come. And I think that's the challenge that St John faces at the moment, I think.
It is a challenge for many organisations. You mentioned the Rotary Club there.
Yeah.
Do you think that St John Scotland is still as relevant as it used to be?
It's a really strange question because St John Scotland really is quite a young organisation, only coming into being in the mid-40s basically, and so in many respects it had an opportunity to actually start off in a different direction, but I'm not sure that it did that. And I think that the consequence is that it tried to, in some regards, mirror what was happening elsewhere instead of trying to reinvent itself and move forward. But I think maybe that's the stage that we're approaching now. I think we are trying to reinvent St John and move forward. It's a very fine line because the Order of St John wider is an organisation which is recognised throughout the world, and it's difficult to under that huge umbrella it's difficult to get St John Scotland up and running in the way probably it should, because there's a great history behind the Order of St John, and that element of it is difficult for St John Scotland now in some regards to move away from. So that's why I mentioned earlier the ceremonial part of it, which is without doubt the order element of it, is something which is great, and it should be continued. That's part of the major history of St John. But it's a recognition that I think that in order for St John Scotland to survive, that only has to be part of what St John Scotland's involved with. St John Scotland really has to get back down into grassroots, if you like, and make a decision about what it wants to do. If it's going to concentrate on the 3 elements or the 4 elements that it's looking at just now, that's great. But it's got to recognise that volunteers working with patient transport and CPR, for example, are predominantly going to be retired people. That if they're trying to attract younger people into St John's, they probably got to look at something which maybe makes it attractive for young people to come into St John's. So.
Do you have any thoughts on what that might be?
Well, I suppose we do, but the problem is that I think it's up to St John itself to make a decision about the way forward that it wants to go. I mean, for example, if you want to get involved with senior schools and young people, you've got to be able to you want to offer them something to get involved with. Now, the likelihood of them becoming too involved with patient transport is remote. They may well become involved with things like CPR training and defib training. They certainly will get involved in things like mountains because they want to get out and about. So, the work that St John does just now with universities and senior schools with mountain safety is certainly one inroads into the younger generation. But I think we're missing out on something yet. I think there's something that we're not doing that we probably need to identify, which would then involve these younger elements as well. But that's a bit of soul searching that St John has got to do. And I'm not sure that it's at that stage yet. I think it's approaching that stage, but I think there needs to be an element yet where recognition needs to be that in order to get younger people involved, you've got to do younger things with these people. And I'm not sure they've identified that yet,
It springs to mind that a lot of the activities that St John Scotland are involved with are clean activities. You have seen the senior side of life through your career. Do you think that possibly, off the top of my head, younger people might be more inclined to tackle things that improve the lives of more working class people, as in a lot of the problems that we see, social problems that we see, affect mainly working class people? Whether that is totally accurate or not is up for discussion. But I'm thinking of things like drug rehabilitation, homelessness, that kind of issue. Do you think that's something that maybe St John should look at?
It's a possibility. So, we've got organisations like the Salvation Army who do superb jobs in their cities. There's lots of social works, groups, street angels, and there's lots of groups who target particularly young people in deprived areas. Whether that's St John's 40 or not, I don't know. I think in order to do that, you have to have, first of all, people with the correct training, and I don't think that we do. You've got to have a willingness to spend a lot of time building up that expertise, and then to spend a lot of money in some regards, putting people into these very sort of vulnerable areas. So I'm not sure whether that's St John's 40 or not. I really don't know. I certainly know that internationally they do a huge amount of work with, kind of that sphere of things. It's just whether or not they're prepared to become involved in that in Scotland or not, I don't know. There's certainly plenty of scope for it. Some of the other things that I've heard people speaking about are things like, hostels. Historically, St John have been involved with hospitals and also care homes and other areas, so that there has to be an element of expertise in that kind of thing. But maybe we should be looking at that thing again, where we can provide support to communities by providing shelters and things like that. I'm just not 100% sure that we're in the position where we can put, people out on the ground as such. I think our expertise probably lies at a higher level where we can provide facilities for people to do things from, that kind of thing. And under the auspices of St John, that might work. But I think possibly we should look internationally and see what happens elsewhere and just see what we can actually do within Scotland too.
Thank you, that was interesting. Interesting to hear your views on that. You mentioned, going back to fundraising, that some of the activities that you were involved with were to fund non-St John initiatives.
Yeah.
Could you talk me through some of those, please?
Sure. Well, for many years we've supported Disability Sports Fife, and where disabled youngsters primarily are able to take part not just in sports competitions within Scotland but internationally, and even some of them have gone on to Olympics as well. We've been involved in that for quite a number of years, and it has a kind of knock-on effect for St John too, because Disability Sports Scotland, for example, have a huge website, and right up in front of it they're paying recognition to the work that St John does in supporting them. But we've also done things with Riding for the Disabled, where we provided funds for them to run events, and we've also contributed money to Sailing for the Disabled as well, where not far from here, in fact, at Lochore Meadows, there's a sailing loch. There's a sailing loch, and we provided funds which enabled them to have a changing room facilities for disabled people, to enable them to get changed and then go into small yachts and things like that. There's lots of things that we've done with hospitals where we've provided funds to enable them to buy beds or chairs in gardens, or we've actually provided funds to enable them to build gardens for patients. And there's lots of things that we've done in the past which is kind of being frowned upon now, in as much as St John's taken the view that fundraising should be fundraising for St John, basically. But very kindly they've clarified that by saying that they're going to enable us to still fund local organisations and charities up to a certain value, which is fine, because I think it still allows us to be seen in the community as being an act of charity, helping other charities effectively. And as I said, gives an offshoot, and as much as it spreads the name of St John wider as well. So I think that hopefully answers your question.
Yes, thank you very much. The 4 new volunteer-led services, I'm going to forget, but patient transport, CPR, defibrillators, and
first responders, and then mountain safety, I think.
And mountain safety, yeah. Yes. So that's 5 really. Thank you. How are these working out in the Fife area? So
in Fife we are pretty actively involved with patient transport. We've got 2 units, if you like. We are providing transport for renal patients in the Dunfermline area and also in the Kirkcaldy area. And the Kirkcaldy area takes it slightly wider field into wider Fife. As far as CPR and defibrillator training is concerned, immediately prior to COVID, we were very actively involved with community groups, primary schools, secondary schools, and also some colleges locally who were going in and doing training with pupils. But we're also involved with church groups as well, where we go in and do training with them. We've tried to set up first responders in Fife, but we've not had any success doing that. There is a first responder group in the East Nuke of Fife, which is set up around Anstruther area, and which I think probably started off with support for the lifeboat service there. We've had interest in fact, quite recently, in setting up a first responder group in the Auchtermuchty area of Fife, but it's still very much early days, and we're still at the kind of teasing out what's involved with that. So it's possible that as we move forward over the next year or so, we might have some inroads into first responding. And that's probably as much as I think we can become involved with. The expansion of the patient transport service would be good. We've still got St Andrew's Hospital, where I think they do renal patients too. We've been asked if we might take an interest in doing patient transport for oncology patients. But again, in order to do that, we would require more volunteers and more vehicles from St John. So there's, of necessity, there's a lead-up period to enabling that to happen. But it's quite possible that if we get the right support, that we can move in the direction of oncology maybe next year. But it's interesting times for St John. We're at a kind of threshold, I think, where we could take off and do marvellous things, or alternatively things could fade back into the point where we become ineffective. And I think that circles back round to the point about recruitment and publicity and membership. So we might have aspirations to become involved in a great number of things, but the reality of it is, if we can't correct and get right, the numbers game, not money-wise, but certainly headcount-wise, we'll be restricted into what we're able to do. So I think the focus going forward has to be on recruitment, basically.
Could you tell me what your hopes are for the future?
For St John? Yeah. I think it has the backing of a superb organisation. The Order of St John, not just in this country but worldwide, has got enormous potential. Here, we've got to get away from a kind of parochial look at St John, I think. We've got to make up our minds what it is that we actually want to do. I think the scope, as I said earlier, in the development of the hostel, the home, perhaps something along these lines. If you want to come below that level and look at opportunities that might be there at street level for St John, St John has to change as an organisation, because it won't achieve that level the way that is set up just now, and it will without doubt need a huge amount of work if it wants to move in that direction. But I think as far as St John itself is concerned, it has to make up its mind about its own direction. It really needs to decide what it wants to concentrate on, and then do a good job of it. If it, for example, wants to concentrate on patient transport, it has to concentrate on patient transport, and it has to be prepared to make that commitment. And it has to look at Scotland as a whole, otherwise St John itself will only be known in wee pockets throughout Scotland, basically. So it has to get the bigger picture, I think.
That's all of my questions. Is there anything you would like to add or anything that I've missed?
No. I think you've given me a fair old hearing.
Oh, thank you very much, Ewen.
Not at all.
Been
Pleasure's
nice
mine.
to you.
Thank you.